So, everybody, yesterday, February 13th, a full 10 days after the Norfolk Southern train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg finally felt it was time to issue a statement addressing the accident. And so he said, "I continue to be concerned about the impacts of the February 3rd train derailment near East Palestine, Ohio, and the effects on families in the 10 days since their lives were upended through no fault of their own. It's important that families have access to useful and accurate information." That was part of a very short thread. Notice the deliberate use of the word continue. I continue to be concerned about that, as if to suggest that this had been a top priority of his since the incident occurred, like I said, on February 3rd. It's just that, he somehow failed to utter a word about it before being shamed for his silence, both online and on Capitol Hill. Ilhan Omar, to her credit, actually gave him a little bit of shit about it. And then, of course, a lot of Republicans gave him lots of shit about it in the 10 days since the accident. Now, in his defense, though, he was busy. At Monday's National Association of Counties conference, Pete urgently lamented the lack of diversity on America's urban construction crews. So let's take a look at what he was up to.
Work with your contractors, to work with your community colleges on building a workforce that reflects the community. We have heard way too many stories from generations past of infrastructure where you got a neighborhood, often a neighborhood of color, that finally sees the project come to them, but everyone in the hard hats on that project looking like, doing the good paying jobs, don't look like they came from anywhere near the neighborhood.
Right.
You can build community wealth that will help close wealth gaps in this country if we can tear down those barriers. But that happens at the delivery level.
Okay, so if anyone out there still has doubts about Pete's presidential aspirations, this episode here ought to put those doubts to bed. Now, as off-putting as it is to most people to see the transportation secretary make such hollow and superficial appeals just as a preventable railroad accident seems to have set off what looks like a pretty horrific ecological and public health disaster, no one who's hip to the Democratic Party's sort of perennial MO should be all that surprised by this. Obviously, the weaponization of identity politics to mask the Democrats' fealty to the donor class is a staple of their playbook going back longer than Pete has been on this planet. And that's precisely how Buttigieg is using his stint as Secretary of Transportation. Now, many want to chalk up his awful record to simple incompetence, which of course is fair enough. After all, his only real qualification for this position seems to have been his willingness to help sabotage the Bernie Sanders 2020 campaign in the 11th hour before Super Tuesday. On the other hand, Buttigieg is far from stupid. And as is true for many McKinsey alumni before him and many McKinsey alumni since, what you see is not often what you get. And so I would therefore posit, I'll float as a theory, that Pete's time as transportation secretary is actually unfolding more or less as planned, and that all of this is to lay the groundwork for a White House run in 2028, since it seems Biden is certainly going to run this time. Now, why do I say this? Because on the surface, it looks like a total disaster that would tank him, but not so fast. First of all, despite his very strategic placement of 6 supporters of color at his Iowa victory speech, quote unquote, in 2020, Pete knows that his support amongst non-white voters is almost non-existent. And this explains why his aforementioned lamentation of sort of mostly white hard hat workers at the construction sites in urban areas is one of many attempts to attract minority voters since assuming his position in the Biden cabinet. He's really made these diversity appeals central to his tenure. In 2022, over the last year, he gave an exclusive interview to BET while promoting Biden's infrastructure bill. He launched a $1 billion pilot program to build, quote unquote, racial equity in roads, whatever that exactly means. And he also pledged to diversify both the airline industry and the recipients of federal infrastructure contracts. Now, obviously, none of those political maneuvers or policy initiatives are bad intrinsically in their own right. Not saying that. However, his grander strategy can be understood a lot more clearly when you put them in context, which in this case means to weigh them against his kid gloves approach to these private sector power players that he's currently, at least ostensibly, tasked with regulating as transportation secretary. And we've seen it time and time again throughout these past couple of years, from refusing to crack down on the airline industry, even as they've scammed travelers for literally tens of billions of dollars worth of junk flight tickets that they were not able to service. They literally owed at one point $20 billion in refunds because they oversold flights that they couldn't run, to his lax approach to the various supply chain crises, to his failure to reinstate Obama-era regulations. David Sirota and The Lever put out a good report on that this week. Now, Pete has been obviously remarkably friendly to these transportation industry giants in these past couple of years. Now, come 2028 or 2027, when the primary is going to take place, right? Companies like Norfolk Southern and Southwest Airlines are likely to remember how well Pete looked after them during these very trying times. Both of those companies are very deep-pocketed and generous political donors. If we take a look at Norfolk Southern, they actually have their own PAC. It's called the Good Government PAC. They donated $725,000 over the 2022 midterm cycles, including $10,000 each to top Democrats Steny Hoyer, James Clyburn, and Hakeem Jeffries. As you could see, they donate a fair amount to Republicans as well. That's how these big companies do it. They pay both the winner and the loser. That's called hedging your bets. That's how it's done. Southwest Airlines, through a combination of their organization, their PAC, and their individual employee contributions, contributed $600,000 in campaign checks to both Democrats and Republicans. So it's very, very clear. These are just two of the more high-profile examples, since these companies have been in the news a good amount in recent days and weeks. But clearly, air and rail companies have very deep pockets, and they're not shy about using their money to buy political influence. And so Mayor Pete, therefore, in very typical Democrat fashion, is simultaneously courting the big money donors with corporate-friendly policies and voters of color with platitudinous gestures and speeches about the importance of diversity in the workplace, yada, 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 right? Now, unfortunately for him, his brand of transparent virtue signaling plays a lot better with guilty, neurotic white liberals than it does with actual people of color, which is why my money is still on Pete's next presidential campaign to fare roughly the same as his previous one. All right, I don't think he's going to go all that far when all the votes are counted. But importantly, he's not going to do worse than last time either, despite his embarrassing and disastrous performance at his current job. Because even after this egregious non-response, the Democratic base of shallow, self-serving, what do I call them all the time, PMC automatons, rushed to his defense. None did so more outrageously than Brian Krasenstein, who I don't know if you, many of you guys know who Brian Krasenstein is. He's a prolific tweeter. He's got about 500,000 followers here. The fact that Republicans are relentlessly attacking the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, over a random train derailment in Ohio. Once again, this was not a random train derailment. This was a preventable train derailment. Tells me only one thing. They fear Mayor Pete's political future. He will be president one day, and Republicans know it. That's among the dumbest tweets you'll ever read. But he got a response here from Mike Tona, 500, saying, no, I'm a Democrat living in Ohio and furious about it. Don't make this some partisan hack thing. Brian Krasenstein then decides not only is he going to make this inane defense of Pete Buttigieg, but then he's going to gaslight this angry Ohio voter and respond, so what does the transportation secretary have to do with it? Is he supposed to be monitoring every single train and railroad? Derailments happen all the time. They are politicizing it, not me. The Trump administration rolled back Obama-era braking requirements. I mean, that's really too dumb to even respond to, but Trump did roll back Obama-era braking requirements. However, those braking requirements would not have applied to this particular train anyway, because those reforms were watered down by, yes, mostly a Republican House at the time Obama tried to implement these things. But they were watered down to the point where vinyl chloride was not on the list of substances that would have required trains to put the electronic braking systems on. So it's not clear that but for Trump's repeal of that entire rule, that this would have been prevented. All right. But anyway, that's the level of stupidity that you're dealing with. And as I'm sure, obviously, those of you who are watching, this is mostly an online left crowd here. Anyone who spent any length of time debating the likes of Krasenstein knows that he is far from alone in his abject partisan hackery. And obviously, that this sort of mindless defense of prominent party officials is the rule, not the exception, amongst rank and file Democrats. And there's simply no evidence, as I've said over and over again on this show, to suggest that this dynamic is going to change anytime soon, much less before the 2028 primary. And so what that means is, while Pete's sort of triangulation here as head of the DOT is likely not enough to propel him to the nomination in 2028, it's also pretty much certain not to cost him all that much, because his ultimate calculation, the ultimate calculation that he can get away with screwing ordinary people at corporate donors' behest and stay on the base's good side with flowery rhetoric and superficial pandering, that, unfortunately, is a correct calculation. It's worked over and over. It's tried and true. Within the Democratic Party, this always works. And what do I always say? It's the voters who are to blame for this. It's the voters who, decade after decade now, have failed to hold any of their own responsible for this kind of treacherous bullshit. From Bill Clinton announcing his presidential candidacy at the literal birthplace of the KKK, to Barack Obama letting bankers skate after the 2008 financial crisis and instead sicking his DOJ on homeowners, to Hillary's support for the Iraq War, to Biden's appalling record on criminal justice, bankruptcy legislation, foreign policy, and much, much more. Democrats have rewarded just about every one of these double-talking sleazebags they've had the chance to. And so Pete Buttigieg, given this history, figures, well, why shouldn't I be next in line? And why would I not act according to that principle, right? Why would I go to bat for ordinary people and cost myself big donor checks when the voters in my party, again, I'm not talking about all voters, the voters within the Democratic Party are so stupid, they're going to treat me as if I'm a champion for ordinary people anyway, whether I screw them over or not. So if I don't screw them over, if I actually go to bat for them and take on companies like Norfolk Southern, like Southwest Airlines, then they're not going to write me any campaign checks. And what is the net goodwill I'm buying within my party's base? Not much, because the party base is going to lick my feet no matter what the fuck I do, as they have proven over and over and over again. So no, this is not simple incompetence on his part. This is a McKinsey consultant. This is a cold, calculating bastard. And I believe that this is how he figured he would use his time as transportation secretary. I'll cozy up to these very deep-pocketed transportation industry giants who will then fund my super PACs. And at the same time, I will pander to the base a little bit. I'll talk nice about diversity, about inclusion, to try and juice my numbers with non-white voters. Again, I don't think it's going to work. But I think that is his plan. And it's really nothing new within the Democratic Party, as we all should know by now.
Please clap.